Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the webinar today. We are going to hold for another 2 to 3 minutes just to make sure that everyone gets signed on to the system properly. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. If you care about immigrant justice, you should care about reproductive justice. My name is Sarah Medeiros, and I'm the Communications and External Affairs Assistant here at the National Women's Law Center. Could everyone in the audience please type into the chat now that you can hear me, if you can hear me? Just making sure that we are broadcasting properly. Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Much appreciated. A few technical notes before we begin. All attendee lines will be on mute during today's webinar. We'll be taking questions after our experts are finished with the main presentation, and we encourage you to submit questions throughout the webinar. You can submit a question by typing it using the GoToWebinar chat function, chat window visible in your dashboard, which can usually be found on the right side of your screen. And a number of you just found that and responded, so thank you. This webinar will have live captioning throughout, which you should be able to see now at the bottom of your screen below the presentation slides. Normally, we record webinars and put them on our website. Currently, we are still sort of working some things out for this webinar regarding that. We will get back to you all as registrants through the email address that you gave when you signed up about what we will be able to provide to you. Of course, we will definitely be getting in touch with links to our and our partners' websites that will hopefully be helpful to you with as much information as we can. At this time, I'd like to turn the floor over to Kelly Garcia, Director of Reproductive Justice Initiatives and Senior Counsel at the National Women's Law Center.
Okay, thank you, Sarah, and thank you to everybody who has joined us today for our third and final webinar of the 2018 series on immigration justice. We are really excited to have everybody here joining us, and I'm excited to have our two speakers, Corey Schindel from Kids in Need of Defense and Diali Avila from the National Women's Law Center. Before I turn it over to them to give our full presentation, I want to first take a moment to talk a little bit about the National Women's Law Center and this webinar series, as well as give Cami Dodson from If, When, How, our partner in these webinar series, an opportunity to talk about If, When, How, and the webinar series as well. And then I'm going to do a short, very short introduction to kind of the topic for today, which is immigration justice and reproductive justice. So with that, I will turn it over to Cami.
Thanks so much, Kelly. My name is Cami Dodson. I'm the Professional Development Coordinator at the National Office of If, When, How, Lawyering for Reproductive Justice. We're very excited to be here with the Center again, and we're so glad that all of you have joined us today and throughout the series. When this webinar series was started 9 years ago, we wanted to highlight the many ways reproductive justice intersects with other important social justice issues. Immigration justice, which we are discussing today, is inextricably linked to reproductive justice, racial justice, queer liberation, gender justice, and much more. We are really looking forward to hearing from today's speakers, and we're grateful for the work that they're doing to support immigrant communities. If this is the first time you're turning into this webinar series, or if you're not familiar with If, When, How, we are a national nonprofit that trains, networks, and mobilizes law students and legal professionals to work within and beyond the legal system to champion reproductive justice. If, When, How believes that achieving reproductive justice will take thoughtful action and strategic activism, acknowledging the intersection of identities, collaborating across disciplines, and working toward a critical transformation of the current legal system. Because ensuring that all people have the power to decide if, when, and how to create and sustain families depends entirely on if, when, and how hard we fight. We work with chapters on law school campuses across the country, and we also work with a growing community of legal professionals, including our brilliant reproductive justice fellows. In fact, we just finished accepting applications for the 2019-2020 fellowship, during which reproductive justice fellows will be placed at organizations in Atlanta, Nashville, Memphis, Oakland, and Washington, D.C. On behalf of If, When, How, I want to give a big thanks to the National Women's Law Center, especially Kelly, Mikhail, and Sarah, as well as today's presenters for bringing their expertise to this webinar. Thank you all for joining us and for your interest in this very important topic. I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Kelly.
All right, great. Thank you, Cami. Before I say a little bit about the National Women's Law Center, I do want to note that we are always thinking ahead, and we'll be starting to plan and think about what types of topics we want to cover for next year. So we would love to hear your feedback on any topics that you are interested in hearing more about when we reconvene the webinar series in the fall of 2019. Time keeps flying. So with that, I just want to say a little bit about the National Women's Law Center. For over 40 years, we have been working to champion policies and laws that help women and girls achieve their potential throughout their lives at school, at work, at home, and in their communities. We are committed advocates who really try to take on some of the toughest challenges, especially for those who are struggling. And with that, I want to just give a very brief introduction to reproductive justice and our topic for today. Well, we're having a little bit of trouble switching the slides, but I'll go ahead and start on the next slide. So I want to talk about what is reproductive justice. If you're tuning in to us for the first time today, or I'm not familiar with the term of reproductive justice, the term itself was coined by visionary Loretta Ross in the 1990s, and was really a response to a reproductive rights movement that too often ignored the concerns of women of color, women who are struggling to make ends meet, and younger women. And a movement that really didn't recognize as much the ways in which women of color in particular might face obstacles of opposition to their childbearing and decisions to have children as much as they are to face barriers to being able to access abortion and contraception. So the reproductive justice really requires that people have the right to have the children they want, care for the children they have, and plan their families through safe legal access to abortion and contraception. Reproductive justice requires that all people have the resources as well as the economic, social, and political power to make decisions about their bodies, sexuality, and reproduction with self-determination and dignity. So as Cami noted, this webinar series is really founded in order to talk about the intersections between social justice movement and the reproductive justice movement, because we have to recognize that there will be no true reproductive justice unless we have other forms of social justice. That is that as long as there are forms of social oppression, we can't have reproductive justice. And so that brings us to today and talking about immigrant justice. And so what reproductive justice recognizes is that everyone, regardless of their immigration status, needs to be able to make decisions about their bodies, health, sexuality, and family with dignity and autonomy. This requires that they have access to comprehensive health care, including preventive and reproductive health care. But it also recognizes that practices that target women simply because they are immigrants, even if they are lawfully present in the U.S., make it harder for immigrant women to succeed and live their lives as they choose. And many of the justifications that underlie these policies, restrictive policies that we have seen and that Diali and Corey are going to be speaking about, are designed to stoke xenophobia and largely play up on harmful stereotypes of immigrants. And so Diali and Corey are going to talk, I think, in more detail about some of these policies, but we really need to recognize that instead of implementing policies that make it harder for immigrant families to establish themselves and flourish, the government should be embracing policies that ensure that all people in our communities, including immigrants, have access to the resources that they need. And with that, I think that's a good moment to turn it over to Diali.
Thank you, Kelly, for setting up the conversation. Again, my name is Diali. I am here at the National Women's Law Center. And some of the things that I'll be talking about, we'll just do a brief overview of DACA, which I'll explain in the next slide what it is. We'll talk a little bit about the DREAM Act and TPS and funding for ICE and CBP and asylum ban, all of the things that Kelly mentioned are policies that are not allowing our immigrant communities to thrive. So I'll be more specific on what they are. So I'm thinking some of you are familiar with these, with DACA and TPS, but I'll just briefly mention that DACA is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and this was an executive order that was passed during Obama era, and it was a protection for youth, for immigrant youth, to be able to get a work permit, stay here without being in fear of deportation. But unfortunately, Trump and the Department of Justice stripped away this protection last year, September 5th of 2017. So that is causing a lot of harm to immigrant youth and DACA recipients. We know that right now there are some, we're fighting through the courts with the various lawsuits that are happening. So in one of these, DACA recipients won, and what it means is that now we get to apply and renew your DACA status. So if you or if a person is a DACA recipient and needs to renew their work permit in DACA, they can do so. And also, if yours expired, now you're able to apply again. So those are some small wins, but of course these are not permanent solutions for what the Trump administration did last year to strip away DACA. And also the other attack that we have seen over the past years is for TPS recipients, which is temporary protected status. So what TPS is just a temporary status given to eligible nationals of designated countries who are here in the United States. And as of July 2018, which a couple months ago, the Department of Homeland Security has announced the termination of some TPS, including of 9 countries, including Sudan, Nicaragua, Haiti, El Salvador, and Honduras. And the dates of the termination have already started, and they're going to go until 2020. And what I think is important to mention here is that some of these TPS recipients have been in the United States for decades. They have built homes, they have families here. And actually, one of the cases challenging these decisions, the termination of TPS, was brought by 5 U.S. citizens of TPS holders. So we can see that this not only affects TPS holders and DACA recipients, but this also affects their families. Next slide. So we will talk about the funding for ICE, for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and for U.S. Customs and Border Protection. So as we all see, and I think we're going to talk more about family separation later on, but we have seen that the government has been giving a lot of money to these entities, over $2 billion for FY18, and this results in more attacks to members of our communities in an attempt to instill fear in the lives of undocumented communities, on DACA recipients, and on TPS recipients as well. So what we have heard from immigrant groups is that we need to stop increasing the money and the funding for these entities, for ICE and for CBP, because we know that, like I said before, we need more of a permanent solution, not more money to these this deportation force, as we called it. And we have seen the results of all this money when like I mentioned, see the family separation at the border. We've seen an increase of ICE workplace rates. We've also seen that they have targeted DACA recipients and DREAM eligible individuals. And also with all the other attacks of the Muslim ban and denying refugees asylum and things like that. So we will talk about the next attack that's happening on our immigration communities, which is, before moving to that, I will mention that all these lawsuits and all this work that's happening to protect DACA and TPS and to find a solution, a permanent solution to our communities, there are organizations that are doing great work. And so if you're looking for resources and how to help, you can go to all these organizations: the National Immigration Law Center, United We Dream, UndocuBlack, the Catholic Legal Immigration Network, which is Clinic, the Southern Border Communities Coalition, and the American Civil Liberties Union. All these organizations have been working really hard for years to ensure that there are protections to our communities. And we'll go to the next slide. So the most recent attack that we heard was last Friday. Trump signed a presidential proclamation blocking asylum for individuals who cross the southern border in between ports of entry. And this is proclamation to block asylum for 90 days. And we know that this violates the plain text of our immigration law, which says that, you know, people who apply for asylum, regardless of how they enter the U.S., they need to be able to do so. We know that, like I said, we've been fighting all of these attacks through courts, and one of them was ACLU actually is going to court on Monday, to federal court, for the lawsuit challenging this asylum ban. So they're going to be presenting at the U.S. District Court of Northern California to challenge the asylum ban that was signed by President Trump on last Friday. So you can see here some important points to know that these types of proclamations and these types of decisions really undermine our rule of law. We know that all these families that are coming through, as you have seen in the caravan, for example, they are just trying to get away from violence and other threats. So we know that when this administration calls it a crisis, it just justifies the extreme use of presidential power, and we have to make sure that we're working to help these families coming through the border. So. So this last thing that I'll talk about is something that's been happening for a while. We've known that an extension for the public charge rule was going to happen, and it happened in October. So what public charge, if people are not familiar, is a term that is used in immigration law and by immigration officials to refer an individual to know if this individual is going to depend on public programs to meet their basic needs here in the United States. And just something to know, this is not new. This rule has been used by immigration officials for about 100 years. So it's something that's been happening and that's been part of the immigration process for a while. Some of the expansion, though, the new changes that the administration has suggested will include public programs that allow families to live healthy lives and to thrive in their communities. So important programs as SNAP, non-emergency Medicaid, housing assistance, and Medicaid Part B is something that could be included in the expansion, and we know that this is going to prevent access to more like healthy, nutritious food and secure housing for some of these families. And something to consider is that 1 in 4 American children have at least one immigrant parent. So this could really impact millions of people in the United States, and not only to immigrant communities, but also all of us as a whole, because that would mean if you don't have access to, for example, Medicaid or SNAP, these families will be sicker, hungrier, and poorer. So something that I do want to say is that this doesn't apply to all, you can go to the next. It doesn't apply to all immigrants. This does not apply, a public charge does not apply to asylum seekers, refugees, certain people with visas, like domestic violence visas, and those people applying for citizenship. So something important to say here is that each case and each circumstance is different. So we want to make sure that if you are somebody that you think you might be affected by this expansion, make sure that you talk to somebody and you see all the resources available before you make a decision to disenroll in any public program, because we don't want that to happen. We believe that you can still access these programs. And like I mentioned before, this is going to affect millions here in the United States. Just as some numbers, this could affect 3.8 million AAPI immigrants and over 10 Latinx immigrants. So again, this is just something that is going to affect all of us as a whole. But this is only a proposal. We still have time to tell the administration that we do not agree to this. So there is a comment period that ends December 10th. So we have a little bit or less than a month to submit a comment. and saying why you disagree with this extension, how it's going to affect you or your communities, your neighbors, just something, a comment that will make it personal and get the point across that these changes will just only make our country, like I said, sicker, poorer, and hungrier. So if you go to protectingimmmigrantfamilies.org, that's the campaign that's working on this public charge rule. So you can find out more information there. There's some fact sheets. There's also a way for you to send a comment there. And I think, next slide. Oh, that's it. So before I pass it over to Corey, I just wanted to mention, like I said, with DACA, we just want to be, I just want to let you know that because there's a lot of things happening through the courts in a lot of cases, we do want to encourage individuals to apply and for DACA. So if you know of anybody, you can send them to to United We Dream's website, where they can find more resources. They can apply for some funding if they don't have the money to apply for DACA. And as well, if you're interested in helping, you can also donate to them or help them in any way they can, or just spread the word that DACA recipients can still apply for DACA. And I believe that's it. That's what I have.
Okay, Corey, it's over to you.
Thanks, Yali, and thanks everyone for joining tonight. So as Yali mentioned, we're seeing a number of policies with really far-reaching impacts, for migrant and refugee women, children, and families. And among these are family separation, recent efforts by the administration to expand family detention, and some of the policies that Yali mentioned that were announced last week that restrict asylum eligibility on the basis of where people arrive. So I want to share a little bit about what KIND does for those who aren't familiar, and then a little more about how these policies are affecting communities that were already quite vulnerable. Next slide, maybe. So KIND provides pro bono legal services to unaccompanied children. These are migrant and refugee children who come to the United States without a parent or legal guardian with them. We also serve children who've been separated from a parent or family member after arriving at the border. And we do that through a sort of combination of direct representation as well as training and mentorship of pro bono attorneys. And so we work with hundreds of law firms and clinics and corporations. And KIND also advocates for policies that protect children, so advocacy before the administration and Congress. And we have a return and reintegration program, so for children who are either unable to remain in the United States or who decide to return home, we have a program that works with civil society organizations in Guatemala and Honduras to ensure that children returning to their country of origin can do so safely, and that on arrival there are reintegration services available to them. So that might be skills training or family reunification services to make sure they're both safe and that they're not forced to remigrate. The majority of the clients that KIND serves come from the Northern Triangle of Central America, and that's the countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And this region has really been the focus of many of the administration's recent policies and its efforts at deterrence. There's been a lot of rhetoric, about why children and families are coming from the region, and an intent to really undermine and eliminate the protections for these populations, among them, asylum seekers, families, and unaccompanied children. And so some of that goes along with the asylum ban that Diali had just mentioned. So what we know from experience is, people migrate for a host of reasons, often several reasons. And, they're not this one big amorphous group that a lot of the recent rhetoric has painted a picture of. The clients that KIND serves, the majority are fleeing, extreme violence, threats to their lives, and they have really no choice but to flee. So this might be violence that's perpetrated by gangs and criminal organizations, might be domestic violence. Next slide, if we can. And sexual and gender-based violence against women, children, and LGBT individuals is also pervasive. The 3 countries that I mentioned have some of the highest femicide rates in the world. We can advance a few more. So while many of the administration's recent policies sort of frame migration as a choice, what we know is that for many children and families, they're fleeing of necessity, both to save their lives, the lives of their families. And so policies that are intended to deter migration they're unlikely to be successful, but really will only make women and children more vulnerable. And so up on the screen are some of the reasons, and there are probably many, many more, what we call the root causes of migration, why people, flee their countries. And it's often, a medley of these things that face individuals. So last year, KIND and several other organizations noticed among the people that we serve an increase in children who had initially arrived to the United States with a parent or legal guardian, but who'd been separated from them. And that's something that the administration had been threatening as sort of a deterrence measure. And, while separations had occurred previously in instances where trafficking was suspected or other concerns about the safety of a child, legal services providers began to see children who were being torn from their parents in the absence of any, concerns such as that, really just to deter people from migrating, so to deter future migration, and sort of also, those who already had come. And so it was a hope that by tearing families apart, it would curb numbers of arrivals. In May, then Attorney General Sessions announced his zero tolerance policy. We can advance a few slides. And under this policy, families arriving at the border were separated, and parents were held in adult detention facilities, and they were prosecuted for illegal entry. And that's despite exercising, their lawful right to seek asylum. And children who had arrived accompanied, so with their parents, were rendered unaccompanied. So unaccompanied children are those who arrive alone, and they're transferred to the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which has, child care shelters that they operate. The children who were separated from their parents were rendered unaccompanied and transferred to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So between May and July, at least 2,600 children were torn from their parents, and the administration really didn't have a plan for how to track or connect or reunite these families. Parents and children are weeks or months without any information about each other, without any contact. Parents were deported with other children. Mothers who are breastfeeding had their children torn from them. I mean, many of you have read these stories and raised up your voices in opposition to this. So when KIND, started to hear about this en masse, we, along with other legal service providers, sent emergency teams to the border, to detention centers in South Texas, where these families are being processed. And our staff met with more than 200 separated parents. And the stories are heartbreaking. I want to share a few of them now, because I think we talk broadly about the impacts of what this means for families, but I think it's really important to remember that these are individuals. And so being torn from one another had incredible and potentially lifelong consequences for these families, from medical and mental health impacts to impacts for their cases for asylum and other protection. With unaccompanied children, often because they're coming alone, they may be teenagers. Those who are traveling with their parents were often younger, by and large. And so they would have, less ability, sometimes they were not yet verbal, to say the circumstances that they fled, to sort of provide information for their cases, perhaps even to know they or their parents' full names. And I think we can go to the next slide, and we'll share share two stories that sort of, I think, illustrate what had happened to many families. Genesis, a 5-year-old girl from Honduras, was separated from her mother, Lillian, for about 2 months, including a 15 to 20-day period during which Lillian had no idea where Genesis was being held. Lillian was released on bond following a positive, credible fear interview, and she was reunited with Genesis, and they're now receiving counseling services to address the trauma of separation. They're applying for asylum based on gang attacks and threats to their lives. Another story, Brianna was separated from her 7-year-old son, Brian, who suffers from mental disability. shortly after entering the United States in early June. Brianna fled abuse in Honduras, and she was told she would see her son in a few days, but that did not happen. Brianna was released in early July, but ICE did not immediately release Brian to her, and 3 volunteer lawyers became involved, and ultimately they were united in mid-July, so over a month afterwards. And so these are stories that, we drew from our experiences, and next I want to share people's experiences in their words themselves. On the next slide, please. Okay. So one from a mother in Honduras: my daughter was asleep when I put her in the van. I was crying, but the guard told me not to cry, that I would see her again after we came back from court. I believed her. But it was all a lie. I didn't get a chance to say goodbye to her. I can't imagine what she thought when she woke up and didn't see me. She's only 5. The mother of separated from a 6-year-old said, my daughter has a heart condition and needs surgery or she will die. I had to come so that she could get the surgery and live. What was I supposed to do? Stay in Honduras and watch my daughter die? I came so that my daughter could live. What would you do? And then from a child who was torn from their parent: we were in the cold place, and then they took my mom away. How come they separated us? And by the cold place, they mean the hielera, which stands for ice box. It's what's often called the holding cells at the border because of their sort of frigid temperature and their conditions. So those are just a few words that I think sort of illustrate the devastating impact and sort of the breadth of these stories and how they impacted individuals. And there are thousands more. As many of you know, the ACLU initiated litigation that led to an injunction blocking the separation of families. That's the Mrs. L case. And Kind served on the steering committee, helping to identify and reunite separated children with their parents. And in June, the president issued an executive order that purported to end that separation. And in it, he substituted what he saw as a viable alternative of family detention. We know that family detention, like all detention, poses its own psychological, emotional, and developmental harms for children, even when they're detained for short periods and even when they're there with their parents. And doctors and social workers and others have really spoken out loudly about that impact. And DHS's own advisory committee has advised against it. And this poses not only challenges for the people while they're in custody, but also for their legal cases, as access to counsel in often remote facilities and in detention facilities is much more difficult. And the executive order specifically directed, we can move to the next slide. The executive order specifically directed the Attorney General to move in court for modifications to what's known as the Flores Settlement Agreement. And that would allow the government, if it had been modified, to detain children for longer periods. That challenge was ultimately not successful when they pursued it. So Flores is a long-standing court settlement, and it resulted from a case in the 90s that challenged really dangerous conditions that children were held in immigration custody. So children were being shackled, they're being held with unrelated adults for lengthy periods, and the settlement really set forth minimum standards nationally for how children are to be treated, the conditions in which they're held, and it establishes a policy that favors the prompt release of children from custody, barring any safety or other concerns. And this covers all children in custody, so not just those who are unaccompanied children, but those who are also with their parents. And so the settlement has been interpreted to allow children, the government can detain children for, this is an interpretation by court order, for up to 20 days in a family detention facility in exceptional circumstances, if that's the fastest the government can screen them. And the government has said that this ties their hands for their policies and the enforcement of immigration law and sort of provides an incentive for families to come. What we know is that families are coming to flee violence, not for this or any other incentive, but that is one of the motivations for why the government is trying to modify the settlement and ultimately attempt to terminate it. So for the next slide, in September, the government issued proposed regulations trying to terminate the Flores settlement. And again, this settlement provides minimum protections for children. And in the proposed rules, one of the things they would do is essentially be able to redefine whether a child is an unaccompanied child, continually. And that's important because unaccompanied child status comes with it. What comes with it is certain substantive and procedural protections recognizing the vulnerability of children. So protections that allow sort of child-friendly procedures when their asylum cases are heard. They don't have to file it within 1 year, which is the rule. They can have a little more time, recognizing that it might take traumatized children a little more time to do that, and several other protections. This would allow the government to strip children of those essentially at any time based on certain circumstances. It would also permit the government to self-license its own family detention centers. So the Flores Agreement provides that. That provides standards for licensed programs, and this would say, the government could self-license its own facilities for family detention, which, many people are concerned would, erode conditions and also allow, potentially for indefinite detention of families based on many of the other portions of the proposed regulations. Next slide. And so as Diali had mentioned, the administration is now pursuing even further and additional attacks on families. So far, the government has been unsuccessful in its efforts to expand family detention. And so it's proposed, as an option, this is one of the things that they are considering putting into practice, is what's called binary choice. So this would force parents to choose between prolonged family detention together, in which they would essentially waive their children's rights to be released earlier from custody, or separation in which their child would be sent to a child care facility while they would remain in a different detention facility. And then also the presidential proclamation, the interim rule that Diali had mentioned, that bars asylum for those who enter in between ports of entry and so on. And initially, people did not understand that to include unaccompanied children. Guidance that was put out late Friday night clarified that it does in fact include unaccompanied children. So children who come alone, if they cross at the border rather than a port of entry, would also be barred from pursuing asylum. So those are some, very serious, sweeping, continual attacks on the most vulnerable that we're seeing. And, I think it's important to remember from KIND's perspective as, as a legal services provider, these policies, they cause harm on several fronts that we've mentioned. Among them, they sort of impede the path to humanitarian protection. And so these are people who are fleeing violence, and they're really, their due process is being impeded by these. And so next slide. And this is significant because more than 60% of these children don't have anyone to represent them in immigration proceedings. And this is children as young as toddlers going to court without someone to either represent their interest, explain the process, or even be able to assert their claims for protection for which they might be eligible. Next slide. And these are just some, statistics about what it looks like. 9 out of 10 children without attorneys are ordered deported. Next slide. But a child with an attorney is 5 times more likely to be granted protection. So KIND, works with pro bono attorneys, and I know there's lots of questions about how, people can be helpful. And I think, one of the challenges now, obviously, is as policies develop, how can people, have an on-the-ground impact? One of the things, donating is always obviously an option and something many groups recommend. I think, given the, severity of many of these cases, the complexity that's resulted from family separation and some of the new bans, it's really important. Resources are important, and so each of our offices and many other organizations maintain what are called emergency funds, so that if and as individual cases need support, whatever they might need and the circumstances that they're in, those organizations are able to provide it to people, particularly in sort of unforeseeable circumstances. And then, to the extent you are a legal practitioner, KIND does work with pro bono attorneys. We work with many law firms, and so you could reach out and see if your law firm already works with KIND. Some of the cases that we're dealing with right now are quite complicated, so an experience in immigration could be helpful. But if you're interested, certainly feel free to reach out, and we can either put you in touch with other organizations if we think it would be best, or if you're already working, or let you know if you're already in touch or we are in touch with an organization that you also are. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thank you so much, Corey and Diali, for those presentations. So sorry, I'm trying to read through some of the questions we received. So please, if you do have any questions, could you type the questions into your chat box? I wanted to kick us off with a question to both of you, really, but on Diali, you mentioned that about the caravans that are happening. Could you give us an update on kind of what the status is and what is going on with that?
Sure thing. So like I mentioned before, the migrant caravan is not a security threat, as we have heard from some of the administration folks. Right now, the majority of the caravan is still passing through Mexico City. So as you can see, that's still a long way to go. They're walking, so it might take them a while. I do want to say that there is a small group that broke off from the caravan, which is mainly LGBTQ immigrants that made it through the border in San Diego and Tijuana. So they are already there. They have been notified that the wait to ask for asylum is about a month. So just want to say that there's small groups already coming, and just to emphasize again that all these families and individuals are leaving are leaving their country because of violence and because of attacks and discrimination. Specifically, LGBTQ immigrants that are coming from Central America, we know have been targeted. So just to keep that in mind for that the caravan is making it.
And we had a little bit of a follow-up to that question. Could you just talk a little bit more about the intersection between queer liberation and immigration justice?
Yes. So I feel that, I'll talk about personally as to like queer liberation and immigrant justice. We, as Kelly mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, reproductive justice, we want to see individuals thrive. We want to see individuals live without harm and being able to access healthcare and things like that. So I feel that being an immigrant, sometimes, like I said before, you are fleeing your country because you see you are being attacked of who you are. So I feel like some folks do migrate to find like more freedom and more acceptance. So that's where I see the connection. But I don't know, Kelly, if you want to add more on that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think what's really clear is both that people when we're thinking about the caravans and some of the other kind of some of the waves of immigration that we've been seeing, that is people are heading towards the border because they are experiencing violence and discrimination in their home countries, and they are seeking. They have been put into this situation because they are they're in a desperate situation, and it takes a lot, right, to force someone to move away from their country. And so there's a real intersection overlap when we think about who is it that we are protecting, who is it that we are granting asylum status to, how can people apply for and get protection. But we're also seeing, in addition to kind of this type of migration, we're also seeing from this administration a real hostility towards LGBTQ individuals and towards LGBTQ immigration. And so I think it's imperative as we are thinking about what immigration justice is, that we are really bringing to the forefront of that conversation the people who are going to be most harmed when we start restricting these policies, and that we are aware of how our own, not just our xenophobic rhetoric and our racist rhetoric that we're hearing in this country, but also how our homophobic rhetoric is harming people as they are able to come to the country. So if we are a country that isn't going to recognize same-sex marriage, if we are a country that is not going to allow immigration, if people's gender markers on their passports don't match, that we are then going to be a country that is actively participating in discrimination and is actively harming our immigrants and immigrant families. And so we have to constantly be aware and call attention to those issues. That was a great question.
And also just to emphasize on stories that we know that this is happening. As in months past, there was another caravan, and while in ICE detention, there was a trans woman, Roxana Hernandez, who died while in detention, and it's because, like some of the examples that Kelly mentioned, but also we need to believe individuals when they say who they are and if they're sick or if they're in need of something, but sometimes those voices are like silenced. So just wanted to emphasize that this is happening, and we can see the connection clearly in the death of Roxana Hernandez.
And then we have another question. It's like, will you share sample organization comment statements for the public charge that organizations can share as it relates to reproductive justice?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the Protecting Immigrant Families campaign has a lot of really good resources that will kind of guide you as to how to draft your comments, and there's other organizations as well drafting and helping to come up with comments.
Yes, and we will also, we are similarly working, the National Women's Law Center is working on this issue, and so if you're an organization that is interested in commenting, particularly from a reproductive justice framework, we are putting together a template set of comments, and you are welcome. My email is not up, but it's available on the website, kgarcia@nwlc.org. You're welcome to email me, and we can circulate those comments. They won't, unfortunately, be available. Well, they might be. If they are available, we will send it out when we send out the follow-up email to the webinar. But if not, definitely just be in touch with me, and we can forward those emails.
And I see a question: how did they choose the TPS determination countries? I am not. The only thing I know is that the Department of Homeland Security does assessments to see which countries should continue TPS or not. I'm not super familiar as to like what they think about, but I know that they are the ones keeping track of who has or what countries have it, and going back to see if these countries are still being harmed by environmental crisis or things like that. But a lot of it is, if you think about it, if the countries that I mentioned, you think about the race perspective. So I just wanted to say that I think if you think of a lens of race justice, we see that the decisions could be potentially made to continue attacking communities of color in the country.
So I think we have time for one more question. And Court, you mentioned that that many of the children of immigrants separated from their families are, might be pre-verbal, they might be pre-verbal, they're very young. And so what happens to children who are that young and then who are determined that they aren't eligible for asylum? So what's in place for them? What happens?
So, I think typically those children, were not usually unaccompanied. They're very young. In the Mrs. L case, there was that population, that was the under 5s versus the 5 and olders. And, that's why the reunifications were so critical, to get information about who their children were, what were their protection needs, what were the stories, where's the documentation to support their claims. And so that was an ongoing process during reunification, to see, to finally connect the parents and the children, and then to better understand the circumstances, because sometimes children are eligible for both the same protection or derivative protection that derives from a parent's claim. They might share a claim, or the child might either in addition or instead have their own past protection, for example, special immigrant juvenile status. So many of the children kind service, for example, are eligible for more than one form of relief. And so for the under fives, I think the challenge is, how do you interview a child who isn't yet verbal, or who might be verbal but not necessarily have that context? And in many cases, what we know is that parents actively protect their children from the circumstances, that they're living in. They try not to provide all the information about threats to their lives, out of the, thinking of the best interests of their kids. So, I think the answer to that is it's extremely difficult. It's something that's extremely difficult also for, courts when they're adjudicating cases. So reunifying and then, sort of taking steps to kind of get the backstory is pretty much the strategy. And I think that work was very hard and ongoing, to be honest, in the reunification process.
So I think we can do one more question. So this is to both of you. You talked about, Corey, you talked about some of the volunteer opportunities and donations and some of the things that people can do to be involved, and there's the opportunities with the public charge comments. But I think what can people do to try to stop and stand up to stop some of these bad policies before they get into place? Are there ways that people should be trying to have their voices heard? Are there things that we can do to be louder in support of immigrants? And or alternatively, what are the things that we can be doing in our communities to make sure that we are supporting immigrants, particularly those who might be at risk for deportation?
I'll just quickly add that I think advocating for permanent protected status is something that will benefit a lot of our undocumented communities. So just keeping that message and knowing that there are solutions. We are just playing defense a lot, but we want to make sure that maybe in the next year there are possibilities to, for example, pass the DREAM Act that will benefit a lot of undocumented youth and some TPS recipients as well. So I'll just say that there are solutions. We just have to be loud and clear as to what we want, and also to say no to, like I said before, all this funding that's going to Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Customs and Border Protection, because these are specifically harming right now at this moment, like today in this second, these communities.
Thanks, Corey. Did you have anything to add?
Sure. Yeah, I think family separation was a great example where people lifted up their voices, and it really did matter. I think that outpouring of support, was important for the administration to hear, because some of these policies become very technical and legal and are sometimes difficult to understand. But this was an outpouring that really let, the administration know where people were on it. And I think it also served a really important role when, parents were in detention, they couldn't find their children, they weren't allowed to watch the news, they didn't quite even know that there was this movement around family separation. But when they were told that by volunteer attorneys, it really, helped them in this traumatic time to know that they weren't as alone as it felt. Even in that really dark period for them. So, and then, that there were people on the outside really pressing and trying to, push for better policies for them. So I think that stuff is continually important, and I think there will be, many more opportunities to engage in public comments in any form that you can, and all sorts of regulations and policies, and it does make a difference. So I think any way people can engage is great. I know sometimes it does feel like an uphill battle, but I think it's very meaningful also to the people who are being supported.
Great. Thank you both so much. I think that was a nice note for us to end on. So thank you both so much for participating in this webinar. I know I learned a lot.
Thank you, everyone.